I decided to visit my wife at her job as a CEO. At the entrance, there was a sign that said, "Authorised personnel only." When I told the woman at the front desk I was the CEO's husband, she gave me a strange little smile and said, "Sir, her husband already came through this morning. He's the tall gentleman in the grey coat. That's him by the elevators right now." So I did something I never thought I'd do in my whole quiet life. I smiled back, and I decided to play along. If this story pulls you in, stay with me all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see how far a 58-year-old man's worst Tuesday travelled across the world. Because I'm telling you the truth when I say I never imagined that a thermos of soup and a clean shirt from the dry cleaner would unravel 31 years of marriage in the space of an afternoon. My name is Howard. I'm 58. I spent most of my career as a forensic accountant, the kind of man companies hire when the numbers stop adding up and somebody needs to find out where the money went. I'm good at it. I notice the small wrong thing in a sea of right things. And the cruelest joke of my life is that the one set of books I never audited belonged to the woman sleeping beside me. Her name is Vivian. She is the CEO of Halcyon Dynamics, a logistics software company she built from a rented office and a whiteboard into something with 300 employees and a glass tower downtown. I was proud of her in a way that had become part of my bones. For 31 years, I told myself the same comfortable story, that I'd married a brilliant, driven woman, and that my job was to be the steady ground under her ambition, the harbour she came home to. It turned out I didn't know which harbour she was sailing toward. It started so ordinary, it's almost embarrassing. Vivian had been working brutal hours that autumn, leaving before sunrise, coming home after I'd already eaten, falling asleep mid-sentence with her phone still glowing on the nightstand. That morning she'd left without breakfast, again, and she'd been fighting a head cold for a week. I made a pot of the chicken and rice soup her mother used to make, the recipe I'd learned by watching over the woman's shoulder 30 years earlier. I poured it into a thermos. I picked up her good coat from the cleaner, and I thought, like a fool, I'll surprise her. I'll be the nice husband who shows up. I'd only been to her office maybe 4 or 5 times in a decade. Vivian had always preferred to keep her work life sealed off. "It's chaos in there, Howard. You'd hate it. Let me keep one part of my world simple," she used to say. And I respected that. God help me, I respected every boundary that woman ever drew. I respected my way right out of my own marriage. The Halcyon Tower was all blue glass and cold air conditioning, even in October. There was a curved reception desk in the lobby and a young woman behind it with a headset and a name tag that read Priya. Behind her, mounted on brushed steel, was a sign, "Authorised personnel only beyond this point. All visitors must register." I walked up holding the thermos in one hand and the coat in its plastic sleeve over my arm, feeling oddly shy, the way you do when you're someplace your wife belongs, and you don't. "Good morning," I said. "I'm here to drop something off for Vivian Caro. I'm her husband, Howard." Priya's smile flickered. It's hard to describe. It was the smile of someone who thinks they've caught a small mistake but is too polite to say so out loud. She tilted her head. "I'm sorry. You said you're Ms. Caro's husband." "That's right." I lifted the thermos a little, suddenly aware of how silly I must have looked. "I brought her some soup. She's been sick." Priya glanced at her screen, then back at me, and the polite mask cracked into genuine confusion. "Sir, Ms. Caro's husband came in this morning around 8. He signed in and went up with her." She gestured almost helpfully toward the bank of elevators across the lobby. "Actually, that's him right there, the gentleman in the grey coat." I turned. A man was stepping out of the elevator. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, maybe 45, with silver coming in at his temples in the way that makes certain men look distinguished instead of old. His coat was the colour of wet slate, and probably cost more than my first car. He moved through that lobby like he'd paid for the marble himself. He saw Priya, lifted 2 fingers in a casual little salute, and said, "Forgot my phone in the car. Viv's still on the call upstairs." Viv. Nobody called her Viv. I called her V once, years ago, and she'd asked me not to. "No problem, Mr. Lindqvist," Priya said. "Adrian Lindqvist." I knew that name the way you know the name of a distant relative you've never met. He was Halcyon's chief financial officer. Vivian had hired him 4 years earlier, away from some firm in Chicago. She'd mentioned him over dinner the way she mentioned all of them, Adrian thinks we should restructure the Western accounts. Adrian and I were on calls till midnight. Always business. Always flat. Always nothing. Adrian's eyes moved across the lobby and landed on me. And I want to be precise about what I saw, because I've spent 30 years reading the faces of people who are about to lie. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition. He knew exactly who I was. He had seen my photograph somewhere. On Vivian's desk, on her phone. I don't know. And he knew that the heavy-set, grey-haired man holding a thermos by the reception desk was the husband. And for 1/2 of 1 second, before he smoothed it all away, I watched him decide what to do about me. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, walking over. His voice was warm, controlled, the voice of a man who closes deals. Every nerve in my body told me to say it. I'm her husband. I've been her husband for 31 years. Who in God's name are you? I could feel the words rising in my throat like floodwater. And then something older and colder than rage took over. 30 years of sitting across the table from people who were robbing their own companies had taught me one thing above all others. When you've stumbled into something you don't understand, do not let them know him how much you can see. The man who shows his hand loses. The man who watches wins. So I smiled. I made my face into the face of a polite stranger. "Oh, you must be Adrian," I said. "Vivian's mentioned you. I'm a family friend, Howard. I was just dropping off her coat. She left it at the cleaners near the house." Adrian's shoulders eased by a degree. "Ah, Howard, of course." He said my name like he was filing it. "I'll make sure she gets it. She's slammed today, but I'll bring it up." I handed him my wife's coat and the thermos of her dead mother's soup, and I watched my own hands do it like they belonged to someone else. "Just tell her Howard came by," I said. "I'll do that." His smile was flawless. "Good to finally meet you." Finally. That word followed me out the door. I don't remember the drive home. I remember the steering wheel was cold and the radio was off, and at some point I realised I'd been sitting at a green light long enough for the man behind me to honk twice. 31 years. We met when I was 26 doing the audit for a non-profit where she was the youngest board member in the room, and the only one who'd actually read the financials. I married her in a courthouse, and then again, properly, a year later in her parents' backyard, under a tent her father rented. We never had children. It didn't happen for us. And we made a peace with that I thought was real. We bought a brick house on Holloway Street, with a crooked porch step I kept meaning to fix. We had a whole vocabulary of private jokes. I knew the sound of her laugh from 3 rooms away. And a 23-year-old at a desk had just told me, kindly, that my wife's husband had a slate grey coat and silver at his temples, and was upstairs right now. My phone buzzed at a stoplight. "Vivian! Slammed all day, don't wait up. There's leftover pad thai if you're hungry. Love you, H. Love you, H." I sat in the driveway of our house for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. She came home at 9:40 that night. I heard her keys hit the bowl by the door, heard her kick off her heels in the hallway, heard the sigh she always gave when she finally stopped moving. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I hadn't touched. "Hey," she said, padding in. She looked tired and beautiful and entirely herself. Grey cardigan, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, the faint perpetual frown line she'd earned running a company. "Did you eat? You didn't wait, did you? I told you not to wait." "I ate," I lied. She opened the fridge, poured herself a glass of white wine, and I watched her hands for any tremor, any tell. There was nothing. Steady as a surgeon. "How was your day?" she asked. "Quiet," I said. And then, because I couldn't stop myself, I added, "I brought you something at the office. Some soup, your mum's recipe. You've been so sick." She paused. Just a beat, just 1/2 second of stillness with the wine glass at her lips. Then she turned and gave me the warmest smile. "You did? Oh, Howard, that's so sweet. I didn't get any soup, though. It was an absolute war zone today. I barely left my office. I gave it to one of your people to bring up. Tall fellow. Adrian, I think his name was. And there it was again. That flicker. So brief that if I hadn't spent 30 years hunting flickers for a living, I'd have missed it entirely. Oh, Adrian, he did mention somebody dropped something off." She turned back to the fridge, her voice perfectly light. "I'm sure it's in the office fridge. I'll find it tomorrow." That was thoughtful, babe. Really. She kissed the top of my head on her way to the stairs. The same kiss she'd given me 10,000 times. And I sat there and thought, either you are telling me the truth, or you are the most gifted liar I have ever sat across from. And I have sat across from professionals. That night I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe, and I did the thing I do. I started counting. 4 years since Adrian joined the company. How many late nights? How many client dinners? How many weekend off-sites? How many times had she stood in this very kitchen and called another man her colleague, while he'd already been called her husband by a girl at a front desk who had no reason on earth to lie? I didn't know yet how deep it went, but I knew how to find out. I'm not proud of what I did over the next 2 weeks. I became a stranger in my own marriage. Quiet, watchful, recording everything. But I'll tell you what I told myself in the dark. A man who has been deceived has the right to know the dimensions of the lie before he decides what to do about it. I started with the money, because money is the one thing that cannot keep a secret. People lie, bank statements don't. For 31 years, Vivian had handled what she called the big accounts, the investments, the retirement funds. And I'd handled the household because it amused us both that the forensic accountant managed the grocery budget while the CEO managed the portfolio. I had online access I almost never used. That weekend, while she was at what she called a leadership retreat, I sat down at the kitchen table and did to my own marriage what I'd done to 100 crooked companies. I pulled 3 years of statements. The first thing I found was a recurring monthly transfer, $2,400, every month, like clockwork, going out of a joint savings account I'd half forgotten we had, into something labelled only as ML Prop MGMT. $28,000 a year for nearly 3 years, vanishing into a property management company. We don't own any property except the house on Holloway Street, which I paid off myself 11 years ago. The second thing I found was a pattern I knew in my sleep, because it's the pattern of every embezzler I ever caught. Small, deniable, routine. A standing reservation charge at a restaurant called Brune every other Friday. A pharmacy on the north side of the city, nowhere near our home or her office. A florist, twice a month, and never once had flowers arrived at our door. A gym membership at a club I'd never heard her mention, billed since the spring before last. And then, the thing that made me put down my pen and stare at the wall. A charge from a jeweller downtown for $6,200, 8 months ago, on a Thursday afternoon. On a Thursday afternoon 8 months ago, Vivian had told me she was in Denver for a conference. I sat very still in my own kitchen. Outside, a neighbour was raking leaves. The world was completely normal and completely over. The ML Prop MGMT entry gnawed at me. So I did what I do. I followed the thread. It took me one phone call, pretending to be a confused customer, and 20 minutes online to find that the property, managed by that company, was a unit at a development called the Ardmore, a glass and steel building of executive residences on the river, 15 minutes from Halcyon's tower and a world away from our crooked porch step. I should have stopped there. I had enough. Any reasonable man had enough. But there is a thing that happens to you when the floor of your life gives way. You stop being reasonable, you need to see it. So on a Wednesday, while Vivian was in back-to-back board prep all day, I drove to the Ardmore and parked across the street and waited like a man in a movie I never wanted to be in. At 12:40, a silver Audi pulled into the garage. Adrian Lindqvist in the slate grey coat, carrying a grocery bag and a bottle of wine. At 1:15, a familiar dark blue Lexus followed. My wife. She had a key fob. The garage gate lifted for her like it knew her. She'd told me she'd be at the office until 8. I sat in my car and watched the building swallow them both, and I felt something inside my chest go very quiet, the way a house goes quiet after the last guest leaves. I'd spent 30 years finding the truth for other people. Now I'd found my own, and I understood for the first time why so many of those clients had looked at me across all those conference tables like I'd handed them a stone. The key was the part that finished me. 2 days later, I was clearing out the disaster drawer in the kitchen, the one with the spare batteries and the takeout menus, and the dead pens, and my fingers closed around a key fob and a single brass key on a tag. The tag read, in small embossed letters, Ardmore 1106. It had been sitting in our junk drawer for God knows how long. She'd been so careful, so meticulous, and yet there it was, tossed in among the rubber bands and expired coupons. Because the most dangerous place to hide something is in plain sight in a home where you're certain no one is looking. I held that key for a long time. Then I made a decision that the Howard of a month earlier would never have made. I waited until she left for work on Friday. She had a dinner thing, she said. She'd be late, don't wait up. And I drove to the Ardmore, and I rode the elevator to the 11th floor, and I let myself into Unit 1106 with a key from my own kitchen drawer. It wasn't a love nest, that's what I'd braced for. Some sterile bachelor apartment, a place for an affair. It wasn't that at all. It was a home, a real one. There were her throw pillows, the grey linen ones she'd told me were too expensive, Howard. I put them back. They were her books on the shelf, organised by colour the way she liked. There was a second pair of her reading glasses on the side table. There was a framed photo on the wall. Vivian and Adrian on a beach somewhere with the sun behind them, both of them tanned and laughing, her head on his shoulder, her left hand resting on his chest, bare of the wedding ring she still wore home to me every single night. In the closet, her clothes hung beside his. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes. Her face cream, the one she'd told me last Christmas she'd stopped buying. It's just too pricey now. Sitting right there on the counter, half used. I moved through that apartment like a ghost in my own life. And on the kitchen island, in a slim leather folder, I found the thing that turned my grief into something with a spine. It was a folder labelled, in Vivian's neat handwriting, Transition. Inside were brochures for homes in another state, a printed itinerary for a trip to Portugal, in May, for 2. A draft announcement. We are pleased to share that Adrian Lindqvist will be stepping into an expanded leadership role at Halcyon Dynamics that had never, as far as I knew, been shown to a board. And beneath all of it, a letter on the stationery of a law firm I recognised, Callaway and Bain, the same firm that had updated our wills 4 years earlier. The letter summarised a series of consultations, 3 of them over the previous 5 months, concerning dissolution strategy for high net worth marital estates. The strategy was laid out in cool, professional language. Vivian intended to file citing irreconcilable differences. The plan was to establish a documented history of my emotional withdrawal, my lack of ambition, my failure to support her professional trajectory. My quiet evenings would become isolation. My contentment with our modest life would become an inability to grow alongside her success. The man who'd paid off the house and made the soup and respected every boundary was to be repackaged in a courtroom as the dead weight she'd heroically carried for 31 years. And there was a timeline. She had been documenting this, building it, for nearly 2 years. I'll tell you what I felt standing in that kitchen. It wasn't the explosion you'd expect, it was the opposite. It was a terrible, clarifying calm. For weeks I'd been drowning in the gap between what I knew and what I could prove. Now there was no gap. Now there was only the file in my hands and the cold understanding that the woman I'd loved for 3 decades had spent 2 years quietly building the case that would erase me. I am a forensic accountant. I've spent my whole life documenting things, so I took out my phone and I documented everything. The folder, the law firm letter, the clothes in the closet, the photo on the wall, the lease agreement I found in a drawer with both their names on it. Page by page, room by room, the way I'd document any fraud. My hands were perfectly steady. I noticed that, after all those years, the steady hands had turned out to be mine. Then I put the key back exactly where I'd found it, and I went home and I made dinner for one. Made pie. That night, while Vivian was at her dinner thing at the apartment I now knew the floor plan of, I opened her laptop. She'd taken to leaving it on the kitchen counter, lid up, the way you only leave things when you've stopped imagining anyone would look. I'm not going to pretend I felt clean doing it, but I'll tell you what I found because it mattered. There were emails between her and Adrian, and they were not the breathless emails of an affair. They were the logistics of 2 people merging a life. Which furniture to keep, whether to list the Portugal trip under his name or hers, when to tell the board. And there was a thread with her sister Renata, a woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table for 20 years, in which my wife described me to her own sister as checked out for years. as a kind man, but a stone I've been carrying, as someone she couldn't keep shrinking herself to fit. She had been rewriting our marriage for an audience while I was still living inside it, and that was the moment my grief finished turning into something useful. Because as I read, the forensic accountant in me, the part of me that had been quiet and bruised for weeks, finally lifted his head and started reading the other documents on that screen, the work documents. And what I found there had nothing to do with our marriage at all. It took me the better part of the weekend, and everything I knew, to put it together. Vivian had been quietly restructuring Halcyon Dynamics to make room for Adrian, moving authority, budget, and signing power to him over a period of years, in increments small enough that no single change ever crossed the threshold that would require a vote from the board. She was, in effect, hollowing out her own role and pouring it into his, building him a throne one brick at a time, all without disclosing to a single director that the man she was elevating was the man she shared a bed and a lease and a folder labelled transition with. That's not just a betrayal of a husband. In a company with outside investors and a board of directors, an undisclosed romantic relationship between the CEO and the CFO, combined with a steady, unvoted transfer of authority to that partner, is a conflict of interest of the kind that ends careers. It's the kind of thing a board's governance committee exists to catch, and no one had caught it because the only person positioned to catch it was the woman doing it. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. I want to be honest with you, there was no joy in it. I had loved this woman. I had been proud of what she built. The idea that I held in my hands the thing that could take it from her gave me no pleasure at all. But there's something else 30 years of this work teaches you. When you find the truth, you don't get to choose whether it's convenient. You only get to choose whether you're going to keep covering it up. And for 31 years, without ever quite seeing it, I had been Vivian's quiet cover, the steady ground, the man who made things easy. I decided I was done making things easy. I chose a Saturday morning for the conversation because I am a creature of habit, and so was our marriage. And Saturday morning was when we'd always been most ourselves. She was at the kitchen island in her robe, coffee in hand, scrolling her phone, the early light coming in soft and gold. It was the most peaceful domestic picture you could imagine. I set the folder down on the counter between us. My folder, the copies, the photos, the law firm letter, the corporate filings I'd pulled. "We need to talk," I said. She looked up. Her eyes went to the folder, and I watched the whole performance fall away from her face in about a second and a half. The tired, loving wife evaporated. What replaced her was someone I'd seen across boardroom tables my entire career. Cool, fast, already calculating. "What is this?" she asked, but her voice had none of the confusion the words pretended to. "I've been to the Ardmore," I said. "Unit 1106. I used the key from the junk drawer." She set her coffee down with great care. When she looked at me again, she didn't bother with the mask anymore. And I'll tell you, in a strange way, that was almost a relief. "How much do you know?" she said. Not a question, an assessment. "Everything," I said. "The apartment, Adrian, the folder labelled transition, the lawyers at Callaway and Bain, the strategy to paint me as a man who let himself go while you carried the world, and," I tapped the corporate filings, "the part of it that isn't about us at all, the part where you've been moving the company out from under your own board to build that man a kingdom, and never told a soul who he is to you." For the first time in 31 years, I watched Vivian Caro lose her footing. Just for a moment. Then she gathered herself. "Okay," she said, and she actually sat up straighter, the way she did before a hard negotiation. "Okay, so now we're being adults about it. Good. Honestly, Howard, it's a relief. This marriage has been over for years. You just refuse to see it." "It was over for you," I said. "You ended it 2 years ago and kept me on the payroll because I made a convenient set, didn't I? The reliable husband, the alibi." She had the grace to look uncomfortable for half a second. Then her chin came up. "You want to know the truth? Fine. The truth is you stopped growing, Howard. I built a company. I built a life. And every time I wanted to reach for more, travel, the bigger house, a different kind of life, you just smile and say you were happy with what we had. Do you have any idea how lonely it is to outgrow the person you married and watch them be perfectly content to stay small?" It landed. I won't pretend it didn't. Because there was a grain of something real in it. I had been content. I had found joy in our quiet evenings and our paid-off house and our crooked porch step. I thought that was love. I thought that was the whole point. So instead of telling me that, I said quietly, instead of fighting with me or leaving me clean, you built a second life and a legal strategy to make me the villain of a marriage I didn't know was on trial. I was protecting myself, she said. You were protecting your story. She stood and walked to the window, the way she always did when she wanted to control the room. Do you love him? I asked her back. She didn't turn around. Yes, she said. I love Adrian in a way I haven't loved anything in a long time. He's ambitious, he's alive. With him I feel like I'm building something. With you I felt safe, comfortable, finished. She finally looked at me. For a long time I thought safe was enough. It isn't, Howard. I want more than a harbour. I nodded slowly. Then you should have had the decency to sail away honestly, I said, instead of trying to scuttle my ship on your way out. On Monday morning, I sat across a desk from a lawyer named Teresa Okonkwo, who specialised in exactly the kind of mess I'd found myself in. I'd chosen her precisely because she had nothing to do with Calloway and Bain. She read through my folder in near silence, her expression sharpening with every page. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me with something close to respect. Mr. Carrow, she said, in 24 years I have rarely seen a spouse this prepared. Your wife built a very clever strategy. It had exactly one weakness. What's that? It assumed you'd never see it coming. She tapped the law firm summary. She planned to file first and define the narrative. You've taken that away from her. We file first. We define the facts. And the facts, she fanned the bank statements, are devastating for her. Over the next 2 hours, Teresa walked me through it. The $2,400 monthly transfers, the lease, the jeweler, the florist, the entire infrastructure of a parallel life, all of it funded out of marital assets. Money I had earned, money I had poured into what I believed was our future, had been quietly diverted for years to build a home for my wife and another man. This isn't just adultery, Teresa said. This is the use of marital funds to maintain a separate household and an undisclosed partner, while simultaneously preparing a strategy to mischaracterize you in proceedings. A judge is going to look at this very, very differently than your wife was hoping. And then I slid the last folder across the desk. The corporate filings. Teresa read it. Then she read it again, slower. Then she sat back. Mr. Carrow, she said, this part isn't even about your divorce anymore. If what you've documented is accurate, your wife has a fiduciary problem the size of that tower she works in, an undisclosed relationship with a direct report, an unvoted transfer of authority to that partner, outside investors who have no idea. She paused. Who else knows about this? No one, I said. Yet, that afternoon, I did the second hardest thing I did in this whole story. The hardest had been letting myself into that apartment. The second hardest was picking up the phone and calling Gerald Marsh, the chairman of Halcyon's board of directors. I'd met Gerald 3 or 4 times over the years, at company holiday parties, and I'd always liked him, a plain-spoken man of about 70 who'd built and sold 2 companies of his own and didn't suffer nonsense. He answered warmly, Howard, to what do I owe the pleasure? I kept my voice level, and I stuck, the way I'd trained myself to, only to what I could prove. Gerald, I've come across some information about corporate governance at Halcyon that I believe the board has a right to know. It concerns the way authority has been moved to a senior executive over the past few years, and a relationship that hasn't been disclosed. I'm not coming to you out of malice. I'm coming to you because I'm an accountant, and because I think you'd want to know. There was a long silence on the line. Howard, he said finally, all the warmth gone careful. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you the documents raise questions, I said. And the board ought to be the one to answer them, not me. I spent 20 minutes laying it out. Only the corporate side, none of the bedroom. The undisclosed relationship between the CEO and CFO. The pattern of unvoted reorganisation. Gerald listened without interrupting, and when I finished he let out a long, slow breath. I appreciate you bringing this to me, he said. I genuinely do. I'm sorry. Howard, I'm sorry for whatever this has cost you personally. It's cost me everything I thought I had, I said. But I'd rather lose it honestly than keep it by staying quiet. Vivian came home that night with her jaw set and her eyes bright with something I'd never seen pointed at me before. Fear. The board has called an emergency governance review, she said, dropping her bag on the floor. Gerald Marsh called me into a room today and asked me about Adrian, about reporting structures. She rounded on me. My own husband, you called the board on me. I gave them factual information, I said, about a corporate matter, the same way you gave a law firm a strategy about how to dismantle me. That's different. Is it? I said. You spent 2 years building a case to take my life apart quietly, and I found it. Now there's a case being built about a life you took apart quietly, and you found it. The difference, Vivian, is that mine is true. She stared at me for a long, long moment, and I watched her recalculate everything she'd ever assumed about the quiet man who made the soup. The harbour she'd been so sure would stay still while she sailed off had pulled up its own anchor. What do you want? She said very low. It was the same question she had asked at the kitchen island. How much do you know? What do you want? Always the negotiation. Always the deal. I want you to understand, I said, that I'm a person. That for 31 years I loved you completely and asked for nothing but the truth. And that the worst thing you did wasn't loving him. People fall out of love. I could have survived that. The worst thing you did was decide I was too small to be told the truth. You'll find I'm not as small as you measured me. I'll spare you the slow grind of the months that followed, but I'll tell you how it ended, because in this kind of story, the ending is the only part that heals you. The board's review was thorough and quiet and devastating. They didn't find anything criminal. Teresa had warned me they likely wouldn't. But they found exactly the pattern I'd documented, an undisclosed conflict of interest at the very top of the company, and a steady, unauthorised concentration of authority in the hands of the CFO. For a board with fiduciary duty to outside investors, that was more than enough. Adrian Lindqvist was gone within 3 weeks. His expanded leadership role evaporated. The offer letter in the transition folder was never made. He took a position at a smaller firm 2 states away, at a fraction of the salary, the kind of quiet professional demotion that follows a man without ever being written down. Vivian kept her job, but barely, and not the job she'd had. The board stripped her of unilateral authority, installed an independent chief operating officer to oversee her, and required quarterly governance reporting she'd never had to submit before. The woman who had built that company from a whiteboard, who had run it like a queen runs a country, now had to ask permission. For someone whose entire self was built on autonomy, I'm told that was the heaviest sentence of all. The Ardmore apartment was given up, the Portugal trip was cancelled, and the great love affair that had been worth dismantling 31 years of marriage, the romance that had felt so alive precisely because it was secret and forbidden and full of plans. Adrian and Vivian's grand future together lasted, I later learned, about 2 months after the secrecy was gone. It turned out that an awful lot of what they'd felt for each other had been the thrill of the hidden thing. Strip away the lie and there wasn't much underneath but 2 ambitious people who no longer had a reason to sneak. The divorce settled on terms that would have been unimaginable under Vivian's original plan. Faced with the documented diversion of marital funds, the lease, the jeweller and the rest, her lawyers advised her to settle fairly rather than fight a case her own paper trail had already lost. I kept the house on Holloway Street, the one I'd paid off myself, and a fair share of what we'd built. She kept her future and the wreckage of her present. Here's the part nobody warns you about. The part I'd want you to hear if you're watching this from somewhere far away, in a kitchen of your own, wondering about the person sleeping in the next room. I expected the silence of that house to crush me. The empty side of the bed, the single coffee cup, the crooked porch step. I finally, after all these years, sat down one Saturday and fixed myself, because there was no one left to keep promising I'd do it for. But the silence didn't crush me. It cleared me. I hadn't understood, until she was gone, how much of my energy had been spent for years, bracing against an unhappiness I couldn't name, reading her moods, softening myself, apologising, without quite knowing for what. I'd been living beside a woman who decided I wasn't enough, and some animal part of me had felt it long before my mind would admit it, and I'd been tired, down in my bones, in a way I'd mistaken for getting older. When that weight lifted, I felt 20 years younger. I started doing the small things I'd quietly given up. I joined a Tuesday evening pottery class at the Community Arts Centre. Of all things, I'd always wanted to, and always assumed it was silly. My bowls came out lopsided and heavy, and I loved every one of them. And it was there, with clay under both our fingernails, that I met Eleanor. She was a retired science teacher, a widow of 4 years, with paint-stained hands and a laugh that came up out of her like she'd been saving it. We started getting coffee after class, then dinner, then long walks where we'd talk for 2 hours about books and gardens and absolutely nothing important. And I'd come home lighter than I'd been in a decade. The thing that undid me about Eleanor, in the good way, was that she liked the exact things about me that Vivian had filed away as my failures. My contentment with a quiet evening, my pleasure in a simple meal, my stubborn loyalty. Vivian had looked at those things and seen a man too small to grow. Eleanor looked at the same man and saw someone who knew how to be happy and who would be steady and true for as long as she'd have him. Same man, same quiet contentment. The only thing that changed was who was doing the looking. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go. About a year after the divorce, on a soft spring evening, I was sitting on my fixed-up porch when my phone rang. Vivian, the first time she'd called since the papers were signed. I almost didn't answer. But 31 years is 31 years, and curiosity is a hard thing to kill. I picked up. "Howard," she said. Her voice sounded older, thinner. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not. What is it, Vivian?" A long pause. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for the lawyers or the way it ended. For all of it. For how I treated you. For deciding you weren't enough and never giving you the chance to be. Another pause. "Adrian and I didn't last, you know." "Of course you know. It turns out the whole thing was mostly the secret." "I heard," I said. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" She sounded genuinely surprised. I thought about it honestly, the way I try to do everything now. "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry you threw away 3 decades for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you found out too late what we had was worth keeping. I don't say that to twist the knife. I'm not glad you're hurting, Vivian. I used to love you. Some parts of me always will." She was quiet for a while. "Do you ever wonder," she said finally, "what would have happened if I'd just talked to you? If I'd told you I was restless, instead of building a whole other life behind your back?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But here's what I've come to, Vivian. The problem was never that you were restless. People get restless. The problem was that you decided I was too small to be told the truth. And a marriage can survive a lot of things. It can't survive being treated like a thing you manage instead of a person you trust." The silence stretched. "You're right," she said softly. "Even now I keep making it about what I lost, not about what I did." "Yes," I said, "you do. I hope you're happy, Howard. I really do. I hope you found someone who values what I was too selfish to see." "I did," I said. "Her name is Eleanor. She's honest. And she thinks the things you couldn't stand about me are the best parts of me." "Good," Vivian said. And I believed she meant it. "You always deserved that. I just couldn't be the one to give it to you." We said goodbye and I set the phone down, and I sat on my porch and watched the sun go down over a street I'd lived on for 20 years. A street that was finally, completely, peacefully mine. I'll tell you what I learned 58 years into a life I thought I had figured out. I learned that being content is not a character flaw. For years, a brilliant woman told me my happiness with a simple life was a kind of smallness, and I half believed her, the way you half believe anything said often enough by someone you love. But contentment isn't smallness, it's a gift. And the only people who will convince you otherwise are the ones who can't feel it themselves and resent you for it. I learned that loyalty and trust make you vulnerable. They do. They hand someone a key to the soft, undefended centre of you. For 31 years I handed Vivian mine, and she used it to plan my replacement. But I also learned this. I would rather be the kind of man who can be betrayed than the kind of woman who can betray that completely. My openness was exploited, yes, but it was real. And the capacity that made me easy to deceive is the same capacity that lets me sit on this porch beside Eleanor and love her without holding anything back. I wouldn't trade it, not for all the careful, calculating safety in the world. and I learned the strangest thing of all. I learned to be grateful for the worst day of my life, not for the pain of it, not for the months of grief, or the cold drive home from that blue glass tower, or the night I lay awake counting 4 years of lies, but for what it freed me from. I had been slowly disappearing inside a marriage to a woman who'd already left, propping up a life that was only a stage set, making soup for someone who was eating dinner across town with someone else. Losing that didn't ruin me. It gave me back to myself. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is losing the thing they were most afraid to lose. Sometimes freedom comes dressed as catastrophe and knocks on your door wearing the face of the worst day of your life. A girl at a reception desk told me my wife's husband had a grey coat and silver hair, and she handed me, without knowing it, the key to my own life back. So wherever you're watching from, and please, tell me your city. I really do read them. If there's a quiet voice in you wondering whether the person beside you is the person you think they are, I won't tell you what to do with that voice. I'll only tell you what I wish someone had told me sooner. You deserve a love that doesn't come with an exit strategy hidden in a folder. You deserve to be told the truth, even when the truth is goodbye, and you are never, ever too small. I was the steady ground for 31 years. I just had to learn to stand on it for myself. Thank you for staying with me to the end.